sinking in sand? Are you walking on water, or are you sinking in sand? Are you walking on water? Are you sinking in sand? You see the heavenly Father said, let the sun redeem man.
Shalom YouTube, this is Alan with the building again. We are going to do another Bible study in Genesis. The last video we did was chapter 16 and 17. We got to about verse 16 in chapter 17. But we've discussed now where Abram had his name changed to Abraham. And in verse 15 we got to Sarai became Sarah, and the significance of the H, the breath of God being entered in. The significance of the number associated with H, the 5, and 5 representing grace. And being put right there in the 5th position of their names. So it's just very important to notice those things and to pay attention to that in the midst of everything, God is throwing His grace in there. We talked about circumcision and how it's a symbol, that cutting away of the flesh, letting those things go, the fleshly desires, the flesh of the life that the world wants us to live, and how we can truly be set apart for God. And so, of course, set apart means to be holy. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and bring in the announcements, and the band will bring down the music a little bit. So go ahead and get your seats, shake hands with your neighbor, and we'll get started. So chapter 17, verse 16, and I will bless her. And I also talked about how many of their I wills and I haves are going to be mentioned in this chapter. And here we just see another one first thing. And I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. Then Abraham fell on his face. Now, if you look back at verse 3, and Abraham fell on his face. So here in verse 3 and verse 17, Abraham is falling on his face before the Lord out of reverence. It makes me think about how many times throughout my life that I have, and also how many times that I should fall on my face before the Lord. We get so used to this genie idea of God that we can just kind of rub our magic lamp, and all of a sudden we can make our wishes, and God's going to grant our wishes. And God's not a genie. God is God. And if you can fully comprehend that, then that's not the God I want to worship. The God that I worship, I can't fully comprehend the holiness of Him. How marvelous it must be to be before God. And here Abraham, we find out that he's the friend of God. I don't know if I'll ever make it to that point of being a friend of God. I want to be His disciple. I want to be a spokesperson for Him. But I don't know if I'll ever make it to the point of being known as His friend. Of course, it's something that I would like to strive for. To have that much faith. It's pretty miraculous. So we get to verse 17. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 99 years old bear? We'll see later that Sarah laughs, but there's a different laugh between the two of them. This one is more of a joyous laugh. It's kind of that unbelief, but still having faith. Like, oh my God, can you believe this? God's going to make it. We're this old, and God's going to allow us to still have a child. That kind of laughter. And when we get to Sarah, it's more of a really, that disbelief. Just very different in the two of them. So it says here in verse 18, and Abraham said unto God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee." So we know that Ishmael was born before Isaac, but that Ishmael was definitely loved by his father. And God said, "Sarah, thy wife, shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him." So there we go again, because that covenant is still going forward, because we are still in his generations. We are still under his seed. We are Israelites. I think the important part here to point out is that Isaac, the definition of Isaac, means laughter. So because Abraham laughed, God names his child Laughter. This is also the second person that's named before he's born. And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful. So that means that he's already done it. Ishmael's been born, he's alive, but he's already been blessed. Before Abraham even asked, it was already been done. And I will establish, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. First thing that comes to my mind is the 12th Imam. You can go back to my End Times Prophecy to kind of learn some more about that. But I don't know why that just popped into my head. I don't really have that in my notes here in the Bible. But yeah, that was kind of a weird pop in. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the new year. Or in the next year, I'm sorry. You know what? Aha. Now I can see. Check that out. Interruption. Excuse me. I don't even know who that is. Oh well. And he left off talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. So he was there talking with him. Imagine that, standing there having a conversation with the Most High. A literal conversation, not just like a prayer where we don't really hear another voice coming back to us, but an actual conversation, a talking back and forth, like you're just standing there with a friend. It's amazing. And I will multiply him exceedingly. You know, if you look around the Middle East and Northern Africa, and I mean, you can just see how many Muslim nations there are and how true this word is kept. At this set time in the next year. Turns out to be exactly 1 year from that point. The Bible makes a lot of prophecies that are fulfilled at exact times. It's pretty cool to notice that too. Another thing to point out here is that at this point in chapter 17, Ishmael is about the age of 13. So he says, I have heard thee. I have blessed him. Just amazing things to think about. Sorry, I know I keep pausing, but I just trying to take all this in. Verse 23, and Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all that were born in his house, and all that were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the selfsame day, as God had said unto him. Okay. So now imagine this. Okay, you got to put yourself, remember these are real people, real situations, real times. So here Abraham's having a conversation with God. Okay, he's standing there like God be standing there with you where we're talking, and God says, you know what, I'm going to change your name. Your name's no longer going to be Abram, it's going to be Abraham. Goes on a little bit further and he says, you know what, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to change your wife's name too, from Sarai to Sarah. And he's explaining all the circumcision things, right? So then God goes away, and Abraham comes back to his camp, to all of his men, and we already know that he had 300 trained soldiers. So how many more people has he added at this point? How many more wives and daughters or women and children are added to this tribe, this camp? And so he walks into this camp, and he gathers everybody together. All right, everybody get together here. You're not going to call me Abram anymore. You're going to call me Abraham. And, oh yeah, by the way, honey, you are no longer Sarai, you're Sarah. And now we're going to do this procedure called circumcision. I mean, can you imagine everybody? Jaw drop. Just, and all that self-same day it says that he does this. To all the people. I mean, all the people. Can you imagine all the men? And the boys, of 13 years of age and old. I mean, just that to me is just, imagine the faith of the people that he's got living with him. You know how much faith they have in him and in God. But when Abraham comes in, he's got that authority, that respect of his people. That when he says these things, they just, okay, well, if you say so, let's do it. I mean, they've never heard of circumcision. I mean, maybe they have at this point, because it is a tradition that goes around other things too. But, I mean, this is crazy. Anyways. Where were we here? Verse 24. And Abraham was 90 years old and 9. So, 99. When he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. In the selfsame day was Abraham circumcised, and Ishmael his son, and all the men of his house, born in the house, and bought with money of the stranger, were circumcised with him. So, verse 24, we see that Abraham was the first to be circumcised, then his son, and then the men. What that tells me is that to truly follow the word, first has to be a personal obedience. You can't expect everybody else around you to be living a God-fearing life if you're not doing it too. Especially the people in your home. You can't expect them to live a God-fearing life if you're not doing it. So it's got to be a personal obedience first. And then you start with your immediate family, your children. And then you can go to the people that work for you and live with you and are in your community. Excuse me. That also makes me think of, as a personal thing, what flesh has God asked you to remove from your life? Is there any addictions? Maybe like mine was cigarettes for a long time. And I really felt a conviction on it. And it took me, 14 years smoking. And I finally put the cigarettes down last year. About this time last year. What about alcohol? About fornication, pornography, money, the chasing of money and wealth. Has he asked you to do away with any of the fleshly things? Are you willing to be personally obedient and cut those things out of your life? The next thing is, we see in verse 25, is parental obedience. So what are some of the things that we should cut out of our children's lives? Are we allowing our kids to make inappropriate TikTok videos? Are we allowing our children to watch inappropriate TV shows and movies? Are we careful with the things that our kids are watching on YouTube? Maybe it's some of the friends that we've met of our kids that we just say, you know what, I don't think this person is good for you. And I think those kind of hit home with me too. You know, most of those things that I just mentioned are some of the things that I've had to have conversations with my daughter about. And then there comes the community in verse 27. What is your influence to others? Are you living that personal obedience, that obedience in your family enough that when you go out to Walmart, people notice it? When you're standing in line and somebody says, Merry Christmas, does it make you cringe? I used to not. I used to sit there and, keep Christ in Christmas. And then I started doing my own research and I found out, you know what? Christ was never in Christmas. And so now, depending on the crowd, I know some people, it's still a hot subject for some people and they get very defensive about it. So, choose your crowd wisely, but always speak the truth. Be willing to share the truth. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can go back and watch that video on the truth about Christmas. And again, in verse 27, we can see that in all the men of his house were circumcised with him. That just blows my mind, the amount of respect that Abraham had. Going from an idol worshiper to now a friend of God. Pretty cool. Let's go ahead and jump there for a second. James 2:23. And we'll flip back to James. If I can find it. 2:23. You know what? And I took those glasses off and I need them again. And the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. The friend of God. I think that's something that we should all strive for. Chapter 18. And the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door, and bowed himself toward the ground. So here's Abraham in the heat of the day, kind of taking a break. And he's resting in the tent door, kind of sitting in the shade, just looking out over his land. Just imagine what he's thinking about. Imagine his view. And then all of a sudden he sees 3 men standing there. And he obviously knew, because he was already looking out, he knew that they weren't there before. So all of a sudden 3 men appear. He knows what's up. So he runs out and he knows that they're God and from God, so he bows down to them. He shows them reverence. And he said to them, "My Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant." So here we have Abraham at 100 years old, running to meet them. And he's a willing servant to them. And he says, "Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort ye for your hearts. After that ye shall pass on, for therefore are ye come to your servant." And they said, "So do as thou hast said." And Abraham hastened into the tent unto Sarah. There he is, still running, a 100-year-old man running. And said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the hearth." And Abraham ran unto the herd, and fetched a calf, tender and good, and gave it unto a young man, and he hasted to dress it. And he took butter and milk, and the calf which he had dressed, and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. So right here between verses 4 and 8, it shows the honor of Abraham, that his wife and servants are willing to drop everything at the sound of his word. Because this wasn't just, "Hey babe, can you go inside and get some bread, out of the bread box?" No, they literally had to make the bread. He didn't just have some frozen meat in the freezer. No, he ran and got the calf, brought it to the young guy, had him slaughter it and prepare it right then and there. So you're talking about hours are going by while Abraham's taking care of all this stuff and having his family help him get this stuff accomplished. Let's flip to 1 Peter 3:6. "Even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as ye do well, and are not afraid with any amazement." So there was no question from Sarah as to the obedience of Abraham. That's how much respect that she had for her husband. So I guess that goes into Ephesians 6, how a husband should treat his wife and how a wife should treat her husband. It also shows that he didn't have to look around for these items. Meaning that Abraham kept his house in order. He must have been a prepper. And they said unto him, verse 9, "Where is Sarah, thy wife?" And he said, "Behold, in the tent." And he said, "I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life. And lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son." And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. So here's Sarah standing in the tent door, eavesdropping on the conversation that Abraham's having with God and the 2 angels. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, and were stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So that goes back to the Romans 4:17, where God calls things that that aren't what they are. Let's flip through it. 4:17. We'll just get the exact words here because I don't want to take away from it. "As it is written, I have made thee a father of many nations, before him whom he believed, even God, who quickeneth the deed, and calleth those things which be not as though they were." So they were well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So at this point in her life, she's no longer able to actually naturally produce a child. Now Abraham and Sarah were old. Oh, I'm sorry, verse 12. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, and pay attention to that for a second, within herself, saying, after I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being also old also? So now this is a different kind of laugh here. This is that, really? I mean, we're old. You're really going to do this? And the Lord said unto Abraham, wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I of a surety bear a child which am old? So the Lord said unto Abraham, wherefore did Sarah laugh? But we just saw that Sarah laughed within herself. So he knows our thoughts. And there's my cat again. Let's turn to Hebrews 13:2. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. So here Abraham is entertaining God and angels. No questions asked, just does it. God knows her inner thoughts. Kind of scary when you think about it, isn't it? Some of the things that we've thought and said to ourselves. All right, so let's go to 14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed, you can go to Ecclesiastes 3:1. You know what? Let's go ahead and flip to that for a second here. To everything there's a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. So at the time appointed, I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I have laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, Nay, but thou didst laugh. So here's the Almighty God that could have just turned her into a pillar of salt, that could have struck her dead right then and there. You are straight up lying to the face of God. He doesn't even speak harshly to her. Nay, but thou didst laugh. So we see that Sarah's been silent this whole time, making her bread, bringing it out. She's eavesdropping. She overhears the conversation, and she laughs within herself. How many promises do we have from God that sometimes we just, because of our human nature, we laugh? You know, we all go through periods of time where we think this is it, this is rock bottom. But yet, the Word says that Christ came to give us life in abundance. And sometimes we don't understand that, and it does make us laugh inside. Because how can this be? Is this really life abundantly? I'm broke. I've got, my truck's falling apart. My house is falling apart. My basement's flooded. I mean, whatever the situation is. I don't even have a basement, so. But whatever the situation is. You know, we look at the Bible, and we can't always just because of our human nature, we can't always see what God's doing. And then years down the road, we'll look back and we'll say, that's where his hand was the whole time. He was bringing this piece in. He was moving this piece in. He was taking this piece out. That spiritual maturity. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll come back with another video. Love you guys. Shalom.